You're someone with a vision for your practice, for your side hustle, and for your personal journey. But when it comes to establishing your path on how to get to where you want to be with your practice, things get a little messy. You're also someone who'd prefer to go in person instead of to groups and listening to everyone else's story. To me, it sounds like you could benefit from one on one consulting with our experienced practice of the practice consultants. From $5.95 a month and up, you can work with a consultant that will give you more direction and practical tried and tested tips matched to you and your goals. For more information, visit practiceofthepractice.com/apply. Again, that's practiceofthepractice.com/apply. This is the Practice of the Practice podcast with Joe Sanok, session number 1237. I'm Joe Sanok, your host, and welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast, where we help you build a thriving private practice that you absolutely love. There are so many things that go into a private practice. There are those logistical, just like filing your LLC, making sure you have your attorney involved, making sure you have an accountant. And that's the thriving side of it, like getting clients. But the love side of it to me is finding your unique place in the world. That's one of those things that it takes some time to figure out. For me, initially it was just kind of copying other people and seeing how that fit, and then finding my own version of that. And then over time, it was, okay, the DNA of mental wellness counseling is this. It's different ways of thinking. It's, kind of having more of an edge to it. And that's why we bring in so many different authors, speakers, therapists, non-therapists onto the show to talk about things that we think matter to you as part of the puzzle pieces that go into building a counseling practice. And I am so excited today to have Bob Bordone with me. Bob is a senior fellow at Harvard Law School, founder of the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, and founder of Cambridge Negotiation Institute. I mean, this guy, his level of things he's done is just insane. He's written, 2 previous books. He went to Harvard Law. He has been just noted in so many just huge places, like NBC, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN's Situation Room. Bob, welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast.
Joe, thanks so much for having me, and I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, well, you have a new book out that we're talking about today, but I want to hear, how'd you get into negotiations and into kind of resilience and resolution? Was that always kind of part of your career from undergrad, or was that something you kind of discovered along the way?
Yeah, I wish I could say I was one of those people who was laser focused and purposeful, but I can't say that. So it's really a story. It is a story of evolution. When I was in law school, I took a negotiation class, and to be honest, I took that class because I thought I was going to learn a lot about tips and tricks on how to do better in negotiation. And the class really bowled me over because what I really came away with was learning that it was a lot more about perceptions and emotions and perspective taking, and it was deeply interdisciplinary, and I loved it. And so that was a kind of mid law school shift into this area of negotiation and conflict, which then over time really shifted. I mean, I continue to teach negotiation. I continue to do a lot of conflict resolution work. But a lot of what I started to discover was that, quite apart from having skills like knowing what to say or how do I begin a hard conversation, people needed to actually be able to withstand the discomfort and the unpleasantness of sitting in the hard conversation itself. And that's when I kind of started to use this word conflict resilience, which then over time became the basis of this book and working with a brain scientist on it. So it was very much an evolution, and I'm very much of the view that it's really nice to have the skills and the tools, but they aren't worth all that much if you can't actually sit with the discomfort. It's like nice to be able to learn, nice to know how to cook. But if getting in a hot kitchen makes you run the other direction, it doesn't really matter if you know how to cook because you're not going to cook.
Right. Right. And it's like, you can have those skills, but if you can't sit with that discomfort, you're not going to be able to employ them. I mean, I remember back in early 2020, when we were shopping around Thursday is the New Friday, and I was reading Chris Voss's book, Never Split the Difference, which I think has a lot of really great practical tips in it, for just like negotiations. And it was funny because it was published by HarperCollins, and I used some of the techniques in it against HarperCollins in the negotiations.
Ha ha ha.
And so, like,
That's
even
funny.
just that idea of using like a non-round number. So, like, they had made an offer for my upfront, that I was going to get, and I wanted double that. So I doubled it, but then made it like a non-round number. And it was so funny because Tim, my editor, man, it was like 6 months later. He's like, the team is still talking about your negotiation and trying to figure out how did you land on that number. Like, they're still just like, why that number? Because it was like down to the penny.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
part of it was I wanted to do my own marketing. I didn't want to have them do it. I knew we had kind of a good marketing machine and all of that. And I just said, I read your book you guys published and doubled what you sent, and then just changed it to a non-round number. And he was just like,
Ha
are
ha
you
ha.
effing kidding me?
Well, it is quite incredible. When I teach negotiation, I tell this story of when I first took negotiation and then looking for an apartment for my last year of law school and doing some research. And, the landlady was asking for $1,800 a month. And I did a bunch of kind of research and came back and suggested 1369.84 to her, and had a reason
Still
for it,
remember that.
right? And that was highly successful. It's very interesting that you bring up Chris Voss because Chris actually took an exec ed class with me many, many years ago at Harvard.
Mm.
And then came up to me, this is way before he wrote the book, and he persuaded me to let him into the semester long Harvard Law School class, which I had to, at the time, go to the dean for because the school didn't allow non matriculated students into a regular class. But he was still at the FBI, and I was like, hey, this guy's like really important. He does crisis negotiation. And if you remember that book, Joe, you might remember that the opening chapter, I believe, talks about him being in a Harvard classroom. Now, that was not my class because he took my exec ed class. And then when he took negotiation at the law school at Harvard, was in somebody else's small group. But that research on having a precise number is really powerful in negotiation.
Yeah. Now, I want to go back to the emotional side because I think sometimes what is fascinating to me is how much therapists just belittle their own skills and just don't even understand how, just the basic knowledge of like internal family systems, um, influences this book of yours. Like, these things that, come very naturally to therapists, that are new to a lot of non-therapists. Will you talk about how IFS, just kind of influenced some of the beginning of this work that you're sharing?
Yeah, I am a huge IFS fan. Your listeners should know I'm not a therapist. I have taken some classes in IFS, and it's because early in my career teaching at Harvard Law School, fortuitously, we were at the negotiation program a part of a collaboration with some folks at the Cambridge Family Institute, who did IFS work. And part of what and really the first third of the book, in many ways, brings in IFS kind of methods and approaches to helping people think about conflict. And that is to say that I think part of the reason why we are less efficacious across a negotiation table or having a difficult conversation with a loved one or a parent or a friend, is because we have all of these internal selves or parts or sides that create a bunch of ambivalence and that we haven't actually worked through very much. We haven't given a lot of voice to. And so in the book, we really talk about, as a start, naming those sides, right? What is the side of you that maybe thinks it's really important to have this hard conversation? What is the side that maybe makes you feel like having this conversation makes you a selfish person? What is the side of you that maybe makes you feel, brings up something from your past? And we have this kind of three-part exercise in there. The first part is what we call mirror work, where we're really asking you to look in the mirror, identify each of these sides, and try to describe them accurately. Because I think a tendency, at least from my experience, and I suspect maybe yours, Joe, and maybe many of the people listening, is that some of those sides get distorted. So in the book, we talk about, those circus mirrors where you look in the mirror and suddenly you're like very elongated, or
Mm.
you're very wide, or your face is crooked, right? It's not accurate. It's not. It's and I think that the IFS work, right, to kind of identify those parts, to kind of depolarize them and just name them for what they are, is a really important piece of then saying, how can I, in a hard conflict, give voice to all of those sides? Because they all have legitimacy and they're all kind of part of what it means to be authentic. And I would just say, from a conflict perspective, this is where we try to kind of turn conflict on its head, because we think conflict can be a way to build connection. And the way it's building connection is when you're authentic about those sides, some of which are ambivalent or even in conflict, it opens up a different kind of conversation. And what I would say, Joe, also is that in my work, in law and in business, um, oftentimes I feel like people are actually in conflict about the wrong thing.
Mm.
They're talking about a substantive thing, but the real issue is maybe being assertive about feelings, or what this interaction brings up for me when we're having it, which might be something from 20 years ago. And getting the right conversation is so important. And I think, at least in the world I come from, right, in law, originally come from, in law and in business, I just look a lot of the time, even when I'm mediating, I'm like, these people aren't even like talking about what this is really about. You know, it's like you're mediating a big, family dispute. I mean, think about like the show Succession, and it's
Sure.
like you're looking at Succession, and you're like, this is like nothing to do with whatever it is they're fighting over, like who succeeds this company.
How do you keep those emotions in check? I mean, how do you build that resilience to have, like I love the title of your book, where it's not only is it conflict resilience, but negotiating disagreement without giving up or giving in. And so that idea, like I think that when we think about traditional negotiations, when we think about conflict in families, whether it's who's hosting Thanksgiving or it's something bigger like, who gets the kids, 50-50, um, you know, it seems like these are sometimes very high stakes, high emotional things. Like, what did you guys discover in the brain research in regards to people that are successful in that conflict resilience?
Yeah. So, one of the great opportunities for me in writing this book was getting to partner with somebody who is a brain scientist. He's at NYU. And, as I said earlier, one of the things I love about our field is how interdisciplinary it is. And, just an insight, really, from the brain sciences, right? Our brains are really evolved to protect us from pain. So the same parts of the brain that would light up when we feel physical pain also light up when we have that kind of anxiety, anxious fear, dread of a conflict. And so there's really some work that we need to do to retrain the brain, which is possible because there is a neuroplasticity to the brain. And so to realize that this thing that feels like existential threat, in the context of, let's say, child custody or where we're going for Thanksgiving, it's important, but it's not existential threat. And so being able to take a pause. We talk about, this is a phrase that my co-author came up with, that when I read this little piece that he wrote in the book, I was like, I love that, right? As a not a brain person, right? He calls it limbic irritability. And that
Mm.
moment when are kind of aroused, right? We have this kind of what's the word? Emotional refractory period. Being able to pause and then name to ourselves what the emotions are, um, actually helps reduce the amount of time that the amygdala, which is the emotional center, is kind of overexcited and returns to more the kind of frontal lobe, the more kind of cognitive or rational side. And there's this really interesting work by a guy at UCLA, Matt Lieberman. He calls this affective labeling. So taking a pause, right? Naming to yourself what you're feeling without evaluation, um, even doing some breathing moves like cyclic sighing, um, those kinds of moves are ways to address instead of ignore the emotions, right? And, because I think what some folks do is they tend to like try to push the emotions down, and then other people who are maybe less able to do that, are kind of screaming or yelling or bursting into tears. So there's a way of, I think, just acknowledging them, letting yourself feel them, which then gives you some more ability to use them purposefully in a hard conversation or in a big dispute.
Mm. I'm so excited to introduce you to the best website designers out there. We have a brand new partnership with Session Sites. It is where good therapy meets brilliant design, and they get your website switched over or built in less than 2 weeks. They fine-tune your messaging, use science-backed user experience methodology, and work exclusively with mental health professionals. In fact, new clients right now are going to get 3 free therapy marketing strategy calls with their creative director of Session Sites if you book today. You're not going to want to miss this. Head on over to sessionsites.com/Joe. Again, that's sessionsites.com/Joe. Get the website of your dreams today. Sessionsites.com/Joe. Okay, so since I have this Harvard expert right here, I might as well use this for my own personal gain rather than just for these listeners. So and I've talked about this on the podcast a bit. I try to be really careful because if my girls ever hear this in the future, I don't want to regret what I've said about their mother. So I'm in a high conflict co-parenting situation. We've been divorced 3 years. My therapist has really encouraged me to do gray rocking, where you're just like responding with barely anything. And to me, I try to only respond to what has to do with my 2 daughters. And so I'm thinking, I do yoga several times a week. I work on meditation. I'm in therapy. Of course, I'm not perfect, but I think I do a pretty darn good job trying to be a good co-parent. And there's lots of times when whether in this situation it's co-parenting, the other person, I don't know what work they're doing, but it comes out in explosive ways, both online and in our co-parenting app and all sorts of ways that I just have learned to ignore. When it comes to negotiations, when it comes to me building my own resiliency, because I obviously have no control over her, in those kind of situations, and this is going to be universal beyond just my own personal, but I think that example is one where it's like, as therapists, we see these situations that one person really isn't doing the work and one person is doing the work, and then they're supposed to negotiate, and it's like, what? How do we even do that? So cure it for me, Bob.
Well, first of all, that sounds like a really hard situation, and kudos to you for doing all the work that you're doing to be as good as you could be in it. I mean, this is one of the important points of our book, actually, is that when we talk about being conflict resilient, we do mean increasing our own ability to sit with the discomfort and the tension and the unpleasantness of disagreement. And gosh, it's hard to imagine something more unpleasant than being in a tense relationship with an ex over how to handle raising your kids together, right? That's like the highest level. And also we also distinguish that from subjecting yourself to ongoing trauma, harm, abuse, right? And we have a whole part in the book where we really try to offer some diagnostic questions, because that's not what we want. We don't want to be misheard. We do want to be heard as kind of avoidance, because this feels unpleasant. You know what? Like, there's lots of unpleasant things in life, but we don't want to be misheard that way. So all of this is to say, going back to your situation, Joe, right? I mean, I would always say first, if I were like coaching you, right, I would probably ask you if you were willing to walk through with some more detail what are the things you've tried.
Mm,
um, because it is very common, and you probably experience this in therapy, but certainly in my coaching, where people will say like, I tried this, and then you kind of break it down, and they tried something, but it wasn't what you were suggesting,
yeah.
which doesn't mean that what you were suggesting would work. It only means they didn't try it,
Yeah, or
right?
they had a version of what trying it was that wasn't the full version.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But then I think, like we could take, for the purposes of this conversation, and posit that you have done all those things. Then I think it's okay. And we have this whole, our framework in the book is what we call name, explore, commit. And in the commit part of the book, right, well, what are we committing to? And part of it is, how do I decide, where do I stay engaged, and where can I walk away? And obviously, in a situation where you are co-parenting, a complete walking away is just not, it's not an option.
Right.
Um, so there are some pieces you can walk away from, and it sounds like you do that, right, by ignoring a lot. Um, and then I think the question is, how do I, and then in my mind, right, if we've gotten to that point, it's, how do I really just focus on the substantive negotiation aspects of this? And the emotional pieces, right? I may still be doing some deep listening because I need to do that in service of the negotiation to make sure that, you know, the kids are well taken care of, or I get to see them on the holidays, or that whatever the issues may be. But I think what it is a much more narrowed and curated set of interactions that are much more constrained around substantive negotiation issues, and using some of the tools in the book around listening and empathy and perspective taking and framing, but really for negotiation purposes, and less for the, how am I trying to use this as a way to build connection and promote some kind of deeper understanding and the difference.
Mm,
And so, I think I've skipped over a lot here, and maybe
sure.
this might not be fully satisfying answer for you, Joe. But I think there are ways, and of thinking about. I always think about, for me, have I done the most and the best I can um, in this situation? If yes, then what's available to me if I walk away, and what's available to me if I stay involved? If what's available to me if I walk away is better, I'm gonna do that, and I don't have to feel bad. I don't have to feel like I just avoided and gave in. If what's available to me is better if I stay in, then how do I kind of narrow the terms and the frames in which we're doing that for my own also kind of self protection? And so I think that's what we really mean by the second part of our title, right, which is negotiating disagreement without giving up or giving in. It's, how do I, in the confines of this particular relationship, the one you're describing sounds particularly bad, but many, right, there's a lot of disagreement, and we're not going to get agreement. We're never going to see eye to eye on whatever, on immigration or on Ukraine or on, Trump or Biden. Um, but how can we negotiate the disagreement in a way that helps us be assertive and stay true to who we are, and also stay connected in ways that feel authentic and real with this other person that we might actually care about and want to stay in connection with?
Mm,
And that's a hard challenge. Our publisher too was HarperCollins, Joe, and we always knew that the title of the book would be Conflict Resilience, but the colon part afterwards we didn't know. And it was actually at a birthday dinner that I hijacked into a brainstorming session for the title of my book, that one of my best friends and colleagues also said to me, he's like, all of these titles, Bob, all sound like they're about somehow problem solving or resolving, but your book isn't about that.
mm,
Your book is somehow about, what do you do? How do you stay in it when you're still likely to disagree? And that was the thing that kind of then helped us ultimately to get to that subtitle.
Mm. I love that. Now you jumped to commit, and thank you for all that feedback for my own personal situation. I do want to dig into name and explore. So name, explore, commit.
Yeah.
Give us the bullet point on what name and explore we should be thinking about with those.
Sure. So I think the name piece is really what I would describe as the self work. So naming the different parts of ourselves, the parts, to use the IFS word, right? We call them chairs in our book. And what are the interests of those sides? What conflicts exist internally? Um, and how can I kind of hold all of those as legitimate, worthy of voice, worthy to be heard? Um, that's the naming piece, right? Understanding, we talk about something we call conflict tolerance. That is that what I might experience as being in conflict, Joe, might be very different from what you experience. And and to understand where our conflict tolerance is vis-a-vis others and how that might differ. The explore piece, I would say, is probably the part of the book that is most like other conflict resolution books. It's what does it look like? What are the skills of how do I open up this conversation? Um, what does it mean to be a deep listener? How do I cultivate genuine curiosity about the other, even when I'm like super angry? How do I handle the emotions? And how do I distinguish what it looks like to be appropriately assertive from cartoon versions of aggression or, my way or the highway? So the explore part is what does this kind of look like when you're engaging those folks that we disagree with? And then the last part, the commit part, is, as I said earlier, how do we decide in what ways, if at all, we're going to reach an agreement, maybe not reach an agreement, but continue to be in relationship in some way, or maybe decide we're going to walk away to the degree we can. And then related to this piece on the commit, especially for folks who, for example, might be running a business. What are some tools? What are some ways that you can build a more conflict resilient work environment? Because one of the other, I think, things that I learned through my many years in teaching negotiation skills is that all of the conflict and negotiation skills exist in the context of a broader ecosystem. And if you're in an ecosystem that supports people disagreeing, supports it being okay to have a different viewpoint, it's going to be much easier to be conflict resilient than if you're in an environment that penalizes that in some way. Like, I talk about a story of being on a board where the culture was if you disagreed, you were a not nice troublemaker. And in the early days of my experience on this board, I'd say, well, I wonder if we might think about it this way, or, here are two other things we might think about. And I was doing this as best I could in service of trying to be helpful. Within a year, basically, I was seen as a naysayer. And of course, I became demotivated. I was like, they're not really looking for my best advice. They're looking for cheerleaders.
Mm.
And of course, when the time came for me to renew my involvement, I declined. But so the commit piece is, in addition to our individual commitments, if we want to be conflict resilient, and if we're a leader, whether it's a manager of an organization, running a business, uh, frankly, running a baseball team, right?
Yeah.
How do we create the conditions that encourage this kind of behavior, which we think are really important for healthy relationships and happiness? And I don't want to get overly like profound here, Joe, but I think ultimately like for the good of our country, because right now I don't see a conflict resilient country.
Well, I mean, you can get overly profound. My next question was going to be like, if people embodied this, what do you think the shift would be, in society if people actually embodied what you're teaching and what you've discovered?
Yeah, I mean, I just love this question. And I don't think that there would be like huge convergence of agreement on the most divisive issues in our country. What I do think, though, is that we would see a lowering of the volume of the kind of demonization and dehumanization that I think is putting a real stress on the life of our democracy as a country. And here's the thing: it's that, and it's also on families. I mean, I suspect, Joe, you as a counselor, and probably many of your listeners, and me not as a counselor, but as somebody who does this work, I can't tell you how many people come to me and are not engaging with family members anymore, or they're doing this thing that drives me crazy, which is in service of the relationship. They make sure that at Thanksgiving, the only thing they talk about is how tasty the apple pie is. And there's something so tender about caring about the relationship so much that they avoid all the topics. But I guess in my view, that is just the slow kill on the relationship. Because if you do year after year of like avoiding anything that actually matters to anybody, then at some point, it's like 7 o'clock, you're like, well, gotta go feed the dog. Right. And then grandma and grandpa die, and you're like, we're gonna stay in Seattle this year. And the relationship withers.
Mm.
So going back to your question, the opportunity of finding a way, not at the dinner table as you're having the cranberry sauce, but maybe if you're with that relative over the 3-day holiday, finding some opportunity even to say, maybe not even to talk about the issue, but to say, I know we have differences on whatever, fill in the blank, gender pronouns, or immigration, or, whether the dam should be placed in the river next town over. I I wonder if we could talk about what it might look like to just talk about that in a way that we could both learn from each other, which I know sounds very meta, but even that conversation opens up something new and I think can lead to deeper connection. And I think if we did more of that, I think we wouldn't be in this moment we find ourselves in, both at a national level, but again, in friendships, workplaces, and relationships.
Mm. So good. Bob, the last question I always ask is, if every private practitioner in the world were listening right now, what would you want them to know?
Mm. Gosh, I mean, I think that the work that you do, I say this as a non-practitioner, is so important and needed right now. And I also think just to invite them to follow that instinct in the moment when they're maybe feeling exhausted and tired, to, in their practice, ask the hard questions and enter into what might feel like conflict, even for them, right? With a client or in their practice, to know that the courage to kind of enter into the conflict with authenticity offers, I think, a path of integrity and deeper relationship.
So good. Bob, if people want to get your book, where can they get it? Where else can they learn from you and grow from your learning and teaching?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I mean, you can get the book, which is called Conflict Resilience, frankly, at many, many independent bookstores. In my own area, I will mention Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the Harvard Bookstore in Harvard Square for visitors. You could also go to our website, which is conflictresilience.book.com, conflictresilience.book.com. There's linked there to all the kind of sellers from Amazon to Bookshop and beyond. Also, you can go to my own website, which is bobbordone.com, bobbordone.com. And yeah, just to say, Joe, this is a community that even though I'm not, I often thought maybe I should have been or might be still a counselor or psychologist. So it's a community I care a lot about. And so I really hope that if folks do buy this book, that it will help them in their lives, but also in their practice.
Mm. Bob, so awesome. Thank you so much for being on the Practice of the Practice podcast.
It's a great, great gift. Thank you, Joe.
The interesting thing about doing a podcast is, when you're interviewing these people from all these different areas, you start to notice kind of what's bubbling up in society. And it's interesting how some of these past interviews that we did on, say mindfulness, that we did on end of life issues. When we look at, even back in episode 1227, the intersection of internal family systems and dysregulation of trauma in the body. I mean, like, I could not have planned this better. But I think there's something that's bubbling up where people are saying there's emotions going on, and maybe you even feel this for yourself, not just for your clients. There's emotions going on right now that I'm just not sure what to do with. And, I think it's awesome that we get to do this podcast together, that you get to join me in this, to think about just what do we want out of humanity? What are the expectations for ourselves and the broader society? What's our little corner of the world in our therapy practices or in the work that we're doing, in the way that we're thinking and the way that we're leveling up? That it's not just about making more money and being more successful. Like, those are things that can fuel bigger things, but that's not the end goal. So I'm so excited that you're joining me on this journey. We get to do this show primarily because we have amazing sponsors. Session Sites is our newest partner. They help you optimize your website. They help make your website designed for engagement. And even better, your site's going to be live in 3 weeks. So whether you haven't touched it in years or you're starting from scratch, they have an awesome deal going on. Just head on over to sessionsites.com/Joe. Again, that's sessionsites.com/Joe to get that website that you absolutely deserve. Thank you so much for letting me into your ears and into your brain. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Special thanks to the band Silence is Sexy for that intro music, and this podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regard to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the producers, the publishers, or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, or other professional information. If you want a professional, you should find one.